to mind when someone mentions the word innovation? For many, the first things that come to mind tend to be things like this. People think of the electric car, the discovery of penicillin, the microprocessor, perhaps even the space shuttle or Mars rovers. It's no secret that everything I've just mentioned either already has or certainly will make an invaluable contribution to humanity's development as a species. It can, however, be quite intimidating, though, really, when you think about it. Many of the first things that come to mind when someone mentions the word innovation had millions or perhaps even billions of dollars in investment money behind them. They were often created by teams of scientists and PhDs and tend to be highly complex in nature. So how then could, say, a high school student with a bright idea or a passion for something truly hope to call themselves an innovator? My name is Duncan Stothers, and I'm here today to share my story and to highlight the one thing, the one key thing, the one most important thing that all innovations must possess. So could this one thing perhaps be having a high degree of complexity? Before the start of my grade 7 year, my grandmother sent me a birthday present, but unfortunately for my 12-year-old self, it had been slowly crushed under the weight of other boxes it was packed with. After spitefully looking into why the packing peanuts she had used to pack it had done so little, I found out that they were often made of a toxic foam that leached chemicals into the environment when thrown away. Why, I asked myself, couldn't we pack boxes with materials that were more biodegradable? After doing some research, I found that the optimum packing material was really a balance between stiffness and softness. You want the material to be as stiff as possible when boxes are packed around each other so that they support each other, but you want the material to be as soft as possible under sudden impacts, like when a box is dropped. After some brainstorming, I came up with the concept of a two-stage packing material. The final design was a cardboard four-sided pyramid that had cotton on the inside and was held together with biodegradable paper tape. Due to their tetrahedral nature, they fell into a rough lattice around whatever object they were protecting. This meant that under a slow compression, they didn't move around very much and they didn't compress very much. But under a sudden impact, the paper tape would snap, making them as soft as cotton balls. These packing pyramids, as I called them, could be both soft yet stiff at the same time. In order to actually compare the packing pyramids to packing peanuts and some other green alternatives, I devised two tests. The first test was a crush test, meant to simulate boxes being stacked on top of one another. A constant volume of the material being tested was placed into a homemade crush box, and then weights were added one by one with compression measurements taken as each weight was added. What I found was as more weights were added, the pyramids were compressed more and more into a lattice, meaning that the overall compression was very little compared to packing peanuts and the other alternatives. The second test was a drop test, meant to simulate the package being dropped. For this, I designed and built a homemade one-dimensional accelerometer made of springs and wood that would visually show the maximum acceleration experienced. What I found was that the packing pyramids performed as predicted, with many of them snapping underneath the bottom of the package, providing for the softest cushion. Packing pyramids showed a statistically significant improvement in both parameters tested. So a simple solution then to a tricky problem. So having a complex solution isn't the one thing. Often simple solutions are better than more complex ones. So if complexity isn't the one thing, then surely it must be having a lot of funding, right? In the summer of 2012, my 6-year-old neighbor was learning to ride his bicycle. He was going down the street, but when unfortunately he crashed into the back of my mom's car. He was in the ER for hours and looked like a disaster when he was out. And I just remember thinking to myself, how can someone who is A, traveling so slowly, and B, wearing so much safety gear, sustain such a serious injury? So I did some research, and I found that even though more people are riding their bicycles every day, cycling is still by far the most dangerous form of mass transportation. I also found that 52% of all recorded bicycle collisions involve a motor vehicle and were head-on in nature. I also found very little safety innovation with regards to the bicycle frame itself. I actually found that the basic frame shape had remained largely unchanged for about 100 years. So in order to investigate this problem, I acquired 2 identical children's bicycles, one which would be left as a control, and the other which would be modified as a test bike. I then built two 15-foot tall wooden crash towers to actually crash the bicycles, one of which I built in my backyard for ease of data collection, and the other I built in a local physics lab for more precise data collection. Half of the data came from quadrant symmetry point tracking analysis from a 10,000 frames per second high-speed camera. That is, the camera looked at these little dots here and then gave me some info. And the other half came from an accelerometer, which was mounted on the frame of the bicycle. What you're seeing here is a standard rigid frame bicycle crashing at about 4.62 meters per second. And what you'll notice is that because the kinetic energy has nowhere to go, the rider is violently pitched over. This is precisely what I was trying to address. My idea was to modify the bicycle frame in some way, such that in the event of a front-end collision, the excess kinetic energy could be converted or absorbed or just redirected away from the rider. The final version had a front fork which was allowed to move backwards in the event of a collision. As the front fork rotated backwards, it moved obliquely shaped discs which rotated and pushed each other apart, and as they pushed each other apart, it extended a spring, which is where the resistance came from. This design worked well because it gave me extremely precise control over exactly how much resistance I wanted from the spring at each position of the front fork. It also allowed me to construct a mathematical model which implied that an elliptical shaped disc would work better than a linear shaped disc because it would move the heaviest resistance and therefore the heaviest acceleration to the latest points in the crash when the rider was the most leaned back due to the geometry of the system. In this next video here, you'll notice that this is the elliptical test bike crashing from the same speed as the video shown earlier. And you'll notice that not only is the collision a lot smoother, but also the arm angle of the rider barely changes. In fact, it's actually quite close to zero. Looking at a bunch of parameters that I looked at, including maximum acceleration in the Y and Z direction, as well as arm angle change and angular acceleration, things like that, I found an overall 90% increase in front-end collision safety for about a 7% increase in cost. I also found that a commercial version could be made very compact, such that it would even look almost identical to a normal bicycle frame. The first frame, as I called it, was a simple, cost-effective solution that was made without piles of excess funding. So if it isn't excess funding, or having a lot of funding, or making a super complex solution, if those aren't the one thing, then surely it must be having some kind of degree of higher knowledge, right? Maybe something like a PhD? Moore's law states that the number of CPU transistors doubles about every 18 months. This means that computer power grows exponentially. Why, I ask myself then, isn't the New Year's laptop twice as fast as the one from last year? After doing some research, I found that the primary limiting factor to processing speed isn't actually the fact that the processor can't go any faster. It's that if it tried to go any faster, it would kind of catch fire and explode. The current processing speed record of 8.8 gigahertz wasn't achieved by some crazy processor the size of a pizza or anything. It was achieved by a similar processor to the one you have on your desktop at home. The only difference is that somebody was literally pouring liquid nitrogen onto it for the few seconds that it ran at that speed. So the point being, if you can cool a processor better, you can run it at a faster speed. The current most efficient method of cooling high-performance processors is something called water cooling. Water flows through a metal block that has straight channels in it, and the block sits on top of the processor. In order to improve upon this design, I use free resources available online to learn about computer-aided design, fluid flow, heat transfer, and a type of simulation called computational fluid dynamics. In order to actually come up with the designs to test, other than just a straight design or, say, a sine wave design, I looked to nature because, after all, it was Einstein who once said, "Look deep into nature, and then you will understand everything better." The Fibonacci spiral is something that can be seen everywhere in nature. A sunflower's seeds, for example, are arranged in Fibonacci spirals, just so we can compact as many as possible into that area. Pine cones work the same way. When leaves grow around the stem of a plant, they often grow in Fibonacci spirals, just because that's the way the plant can maximize the amount of light that each leaf receives. Along a similar vein, when it comes to heat sinks, a general rule is the more surface area there is, the more efficient the cooling is. So after a number of designs had been created and then tested, I found that the designs based off of the Fibonacci spirals found in nature not only had a higher surface area, but I found that they also seemed to show a kind of synergy with the nanoparticles in the nanofluid. This is a CFD simulation of nanofluid I made running through a standard straight block. And one thing you'll notice is the interaction between actual particles and the walls of the block is very, very low. Now if we go to the next video, we can see that the particles actually increase in concentration near the fins of the block due to centripetal acceleration, effectively forcing the heat from the fins of the block into the particles of the fluid. In order to actually test the block, manufactured out of metal and some other parts manufactured out of plastic, and then built a computer in my basement and overclocked it to simulate a high-performance server. In the end, I found that for my optimum spiral design with nanofluid compared to a typical straight design with water, the processor stayed 3.6 and 3.7 degrees cooler at a low and high flow rate respectively. And now what that actually means is that I was able, with my system, to run the processor about 12% faster without using any more energy to cool it. The nanofluid CPU cooler, like the first frame and like packing pyramids, was a simple, cost-effective solution that was made without a university degree in heat transfer and fluid flow. It would be silly, however, to put frankly, that having something like a lot of funding, a nice lab, or a university degree wouldn't help when pushing the boundaries in some areas. The point is that with an ever-increasing amount of free scientific resources available online, it's becoming easier every day for our generation to engage in scientific research at a younger age. The things mentioned earlier you can think of them like accelerators of innovation, but it's important to note that their absence is not a barrier. There's only one real obstacle to overcome when it comes to innovation. There's only one key thing that they all have in common, which is someone who asks the simple question, why? Thank you.